welcome to flipped video 7.1, and this is our lesson about the Enlightenment. So in this lesson we're going to address, or in this flip video, we're going to address three major questions. So please title this flip video The Enlightenment, or Introduction to the Enlightenment, and please be sure you're shifting the essential question based upon what you see as the question at the top. So we're going to back it up. Before we talk about what this new idea of what the Enlightenment is, we need to set the stage for what's happening both in Europe as a whole and Europe as its relationship with the colonies. So let's start off discussing about the 1700s, never forgetting, of course, that that is the 1800s because it's the 17th set of 100 years. In the 1800s, 1700s, 18th century, as people became more focused on themselves, so the ideas of the Renaissance, of the classical Greek and Rome, the celebration of human capabilities through humanism, this age of exploration to understand the world around them, the ideas of creating countries' power versus the religious power, people begin to apply these questioning techniques about what is authority, what is the true source of power, what are the answers of the scientific world around us. Those same kinds of questioning and thought processes are now going to be manifested and applied to the government and what the true nature of government is, how governments should be structured, so on and so forth. So I'm going to give you one definition of this movement at the beginning of the lesson, and we're going to return to it and break it down in greater detail towards the end. So the Enlightenment itself, what it was a philosophical movement. Remember that philosophies, we initially hammered out a definition of that when we talked about Taoism and Confucianism, so this way of thinking that emerged in the 18th century that fostered the belief that people or one could reform society by creating rational laws that governed social behavior. So where you see again that presence and that rise of reason. We started talking about that with the scientific revolution. And it's no coincidence that the Enlightenment is going to grow out of the scientific revolution and the Renaissance, because people are going to really start to search and seek reason rather than simply accepting traditional practices and authority. So some of the things, these thought processes that are in motion already. We already have the existence of this belief that humans are important, that human capability is to be valued, human intellect is to be valued, the human world matters and is significant. We see similarly this rise from the Renaissance in individuality, that people are focused on their self-interest. They're not perhaps as much concerned with the group think that would have been the case, say, on a manor, for example. We're starting to see individual expression. We see that through art. We saw that through the work of the scientists. And this age of exploration, even, we see the interest in self-glory and fame more so than anything else. We start to see this belief in empowerment, that people are going to start to seek fairness and rights from the national government, meaning specifically their monarchs. They're going to see that people are going to start to question what rights are they naturally born with, that we're something we're just going to come up soon. And we also see a rise of what's known as nationalism, that people start to turn their attentions towards political systems. We see this in that those absolute rulers we're about to return to momentarily are going to start returning to, are going to be focusing on how to create and to build a strong united country under their rule. So why did this movement begin, right? At the time, this is a review of something we already learned quite a while back. We learned that at the time, Europe was being ruled by absolute monarch. And these absolute monarchs capitalized on, meaning taking advantage, they capitalized on all of the various movements of the Renaissance, of the scientific revolution, of general changes in economic and political policy that were all weakening the political role of the Catholic Church. And in turn, these monarchs are assuming more and more power. So that's the system we already knew. For example, the person at the right there you see, actually, you can't quite see that picture. The person at the right you see is King Louis XIV. And he's known as being a particularly rich and greedy and vain man in many ways, but was someone who was a true representation of tremendous wealth and power. And these absolute monarchs ruled without preference to the social groups. For the most part, these absolute monarchs were ruling in their own self-interest. And there was no better example of that than this French king, King Louis XIV, than the palace he created for himself, which you know is actually named as Versailles. We talked about this already. Here's a picture of Versailles, so a painting of Versailles, just so you can see its massive scope. And I'm actually going to show you pictures that I took when I was there. And you can see just that same picture looking out. This is standing on the steps of Versailles, looking out into the massive, massive gardens. There's yours truly. Again, another picture here. I couldn't even fit all of Versailles into one of the pictures, so that's just one of the sides, and imagine that duplicated times two. So there's no better example of the way in which these absolute monarchs were acting in their own self-interest than this picture here. This is the hall of mirrors. Glass was extremely expensive to make, so to have an entire room with gilded, which means plated with gold, gilded decorations on the walls here, these crystal chandeliers, these mirrors, just an entire hallway, this massive dining hall, and was where King Louis XIV would bring in order to impress the people around him. But what with this really, the message this is clearly sending, and they both reflecting, haha, pun, mirrors reflecting, reflecting about King Louis is that he is very much acting in his own benefit. And so this concept of a monarch acting in their own benefit, even though most people of the day still subscribe to the belief that the absolute monarch was right and this was the appropriate form of government, there's a very vocal and growing group of people who are starting to call into question the validity of this entire system of a monarch, of someone who inherits the rule rather than actually earning it, or perhaps what we'll ultimately see being selected by the people himself. So some of this room, this Versailles, what ultimately becomes relaying the groundwork for later protests against this man, we're starting to see a growing movement of just simply questioning and questioning the reasons behind why government structures are structured that are the way they are. Speaking of what are the way they are, let's talk about what's actually happening in Europe politically. Most of these places did have what we saw that we with the Magna Carta. We saw that there were some movements. The Magna Carta was in England, so we were just speaking about France a second ago. There were some movements in England and several other European countries to create legislative institutions. A legislator is the branch of the government that makes the laws. So in the United States, that's our legislative. Our legislator is Congress, the House of Representatives, and the Senate. These these institutions are limiting the king's power, but for the most part, and this is exactly what we saw with the Magna Carta, that they still mostly consisted of nobles whose interests were not usually that different from the king's. So you have a legislative group who's got power, but for the most part, they were reinforcing the king's power, not necessarily overturning it. An example of that here would be the British Parliament, and this is a product. This again, the Magna Carta came out of England under King John. The British Parliament had the group known as the House of Lords, excuse me, which was comprised of the nobles and the clergy and the Anglican Church. That was that Protestant church that broke off with Henry VII. And they had the House of Commons, which was the lower house, where the quote-unquote commoners had elected representatives, the regular old people. This is known as a bicameral, meaning two houses. This should sound very familiar to you for the exact reason I just stated. We have a bicameral legislator as well, the House and the Senate. That is not a coincidence. That was modeled directly after this system here in the British Parliament. Also in Britain, we saw an emerging change that's going to lay the groundwork and is going to motivate some of the people of the Enlightenment. That we have what's known as the Glorious Revolution. This occurred in England. And the significance of this revolution was really simply the fact that the British king and queen themselves must submit to the laws made by Parliament. So what this now means is we see a shift between the monarchs being pure leaders and absolute leaders, and this is specifically in Britain that I'm speaking about, not in France, not in Spain. In Britain, we start to see that Parliament is now going to be taking control. Those legislative groups filled with representatives, House of Commons, House of Lords, these are now going to be taking premier power, and that the king and the monarch is going to start increasingly becoming a figurehead. That's that term we learned that means someone who is a leader in pretty much in name only. So this is really laying the groundwork for the shift between the absolute monarchs in Europe to starting to see the emergence of people demanding rights from there. We also have something in France that's emerging known as the three estates. So there's that social system. We actually talked about it quite a while ago. But France had a social class system where the nobles were at the very top of society, then the clergy, and then the land-owning commoners. And they had groups that we'll speak about next a couple of classes from now. They also, too, had a legislative group that represented them, but it really was in name only. The king was really trying to assert more power in France. These conditions, so all of these growing movements, all of these growing ideas, some of the shifts in the political structures that we see in Europe are all giving rise to this movement of this philosophical movement known as the Enlightenment. And so this really started in the 1650s and emerged all the way through the 1800s, but truly defined the 18th century, which would be the 1700s. And in this, remember you got that definition at the beginning? Well, here's it is coming back again. This is a gradual movement, and it was expressed in literature, it was expressed in art, it was expressed in music. That's when we see the rise and the creation of classical music. It really comes back to this period. This is a movement whereby reason and logic were going to be applied to the principles of government. So no longer are people just going to accept the belief that someone says X and that means it's law simply because they are the king or because they are the leader. Suddenly people are going to start to say, well, what makes the most sense? It's almost as if you can hear Francis Bacon's scientific method here. If you apply the independent variable to the dependent variable, which one is going to create the best system of government and the best ways of living, or best government structure? Just to peek there, some of the Enlightenment centers. You can see we have some Enlightened centers in the British colonies. That's important. In Boston and Philadelphia. You see London. In England, you see Edinburgh, which is in modern day Scotland. Whew, Scotland. You can see there in in France, in Paris, in Madrid, in Lisbon, all areas that are major other capitals of these places. So really, what was this movement? What was this change that's going to start to call into question the leaders? What this was these European philosophes. That's a term that means public intellectuals who applied reason to politics, to science, to philosophy, to economics. So these are thinkers. Philosophers are actually just as a French term for thinker or philosopher. These European philosophers wrote their theories about the roles of government, of rulers, of citizens, and how everyone should be cooperating and interacting with one another. Essentially coming up with this, what's known as a social contract. The relationship between the ruler and the ruled. It's going to be a mutual set of responsibilities. What does the ruler need to do for the people? What do the people need to agree to do for the ruler? What creates the most effective society? They really emphasized reason, as I think is clear now, analysis, we're seeing what really makes sense and works, and individualism over just simply blindly taking authority. Now, that's not to say that people didn't support that everyone didn't simply abandon this idea of a monarchy and of kings. That's not the case. Rather, there was a larger group of people instead who are simply emphasizing that the king's power too is should be questioned. They met in saloons or salons, but the saloons is how it would be pronounced, which are basically coffee houses. And so you just have this vision of people sitting around discussing these ideas, major ideas of government and what government should look like and should be built upon. Now, do keep in mind, it's important not to overemphasize the Enlightenment thinkers were a product of history as well. They were not the first people to create even more fair or balanced or rational systems of government. But this is emerging in Europe, is going to spread throughout European society, and of course, is now going to affect colonies, right? If these European powers have been colonizing and taking over different areas of the world, well, that now means that whole entire relationship of a mother country and the colonies is going to change. Let's flip it over to the other side. So that was what was happening in Europe. In the colonies also had their own legislative bodies. They were set up very similarly to the parliament in the British colonies, so those legislative bodies. Of course, this was not an equal society. This is not a society based upon, despite what it's going to claim to be, based upon seeking and benefiting all people. So this is really only those legislative groups only included people of European descent, even European-born colonists. So these are the people, again, race. Is based on race and discrimination in that way. And women, of course, were not allowed in this either, so you can see the gender discrimination there. As the colonies persisted through generations, more and more American-born people were gaining influence and political power. And if you're born in the Americas but ruled by this distant, faraway power, well, the Enlightenment ideas are going to start to sound pretty interesting to you. Of, well, wait, why are we ruled by someone who's far away? Why don't we have a voice in our own parliament that's supposedly to rule over us? So we start to see that these systems are going to start to call into question many of these practices. One little side note I just skipped over there by accident here is that the educational institutions are starting to become more established. Of course, they were only for the private, they're all private and they're for the wealthy and powerful. But again, we see the groundwork being laid. That printing press is now, of course, in full swing, so we can see literature and ideas being manufactured and spread in ways that is going to resonate pretty strongly with many people of the colonies. And the bottom line here is that we start to see this elite class of people, so the tippy top of society. Common man was not necessarily part of the Enlightenment, but what we do see are these social elite who learned about the writings of the philosophers in Europe, and they start to see a pretty stark contrast with these ideas of the Enlightenment, doing what's rational, what benefits people, and the realities of the colonial world that they're living in, and this colonial relationship and this mercantilism in their economic strategies. So, what we're going to see is a big confrontation between the ideas of the Enlightenment thinkers of reason, of rationality, of logic in government, coming into great conflict with the practices of colonialism. That is it. We almost skipped your analysis questions. There we are. Here are your analysis questions. See you guys in class.